Hey, A pushers, Saturday afternoon, putting together a nice little lecture for you guys on American life in the 17th century. Playing catch up here. We're going to be looking at the political, social, and economic aspects of all of the 13 colonies, kind of trying to synthesize it and put it all together for you. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's start off looking a little bit at the Chesapeake. A lot of this will be review. So hopefully you guys remember that in the Chesapeake, that one of the big distinguishing factors about them was that you had a lot of single men coming into the colony. It was a very marshy area, diseases were high, and the Europeans didn't have the resistance to a lot of those diseases. So as a result of that, you have a high death rate. You mostly have, again, these men coming in. There's not a lot of families, so you have slow growth. However, you do have a ton of indentured servants coming in. About 3/4 of the people coming into the Chesapeake and to the South eventually will be indentured servants. So, I mean, you have slow growth. I mean, you look at Jamestown and how long it took them to get on their feet, but you know, tobacco is really kind of that big thing that's going to really turn everything around. But initially, though, we're looking at slow growth. A lot of people coming in, mostly indentured servants, not a ton of families. And education is not going to be a huge priority in the South because we're largely looking at economic motives of the people coming into the colonies. So another thing with education as well, because you have these large plantations that are spread out all over the place, you don't have that development of major cities where kids would be going to school if there was going to be a school. I mean, you did have some schoolhouses out in the countryside and stuff like that, but for the most part, education it's minimal. Maybe an elementary education for a decent amount of people, and a lot of it probably is mostly done by the families at home. A lot of the women would educate their kids on their own. And that's going to be a stark contrast to what's going on in New England, of course, where education is going to be a key aspect. And we'll see that many New England towns actually made it a priority for them to have education within their colonies. Scarcity of women, again, that's a big aspect of the Chesapeake region. And because there were so few women, if you remember 1619, that key date, were three big things happening. One of those being women coming into Jamestown. That actually gives women a little bit of empowerment because they kind of have, for lack of better terminology, pick of the litter when it comes to who they want their husbands to be. So that gives them a little bit more sense of power than you would see in maybe some of the other regions in the colonies. As you guys know, the thing that really is going to completely transform Jamestown and eventually all of Virginia is going to be tobacco. Tobacco is large-scale plantation-style agriculture. We talked about how it's land exhaustive, and the colonists didn't use the best farming methods. In fact, Native American Indians used way better farming methods than the colonists did. So what ends up happening is that they are growing all this stuff, they are ruining the soil, and they have to move on. And with that, then you're going to have more clashes with Native American Indians. Again, the environment's going to be impacted significantly, so that's kind of significant. And again, you have all these people coming with the head right system. You know, in tobacco, once Jamestown gets back on its feet and Virginia becomes this large-scale plantation agricultural society, you do have a desire for more people wanting to come into the Chesapeake and the southern area because of opportunity. Remember, in England at the time, you had a lot of people who were out of a job. So that head right system that was used by a lot of the joint stock companies, basically you'll get so many acreage of land for however many people you bring over. So, I mean, that enticed a lot of people, especially these people who will become indentured servants, because the opportunity eventually that they would get land after their servitude was that was a great incentive for them to leave England. So as we know, with tobacco, plantation style agriculture, again, that it's very labor intensive as well. So the indentured servants were absolutely needed by these planters, and they will be brought into the colony, Virginia and Maryland and the other colonies, in just large droves because they were something that was needed. And again, the people in England were willing to put themselves into indentured servitude because of the potential of opportunity. Just reviewing a little bit about indentured servitude. Most served 4 to 7 years. Most actually died before their servitude was up because the conditions were so poor. Um, Most of the people coming into the Chesapeake area were indentured servants. So when we look at population growth within the South and in the Chesapeake, at first it was largely due to the fact that you had all these indentured servants coming in. It wasn't a result of natural reproduction, like we'll see, in the New England colonies. A big point is this one right here that I'm highlighting, that less than half actually became landowners. This is going to be a big thing we'll talk about in this lecture, that a lot of these servants never got the land that they were promised after their servitude was up, and they're going to end up having to make it on their own, go into the backcountry themselves, cut down all the trees themselves, deal with the Native American Indians themselves, and eventually we're going to see they're going to get a little irritated with this. And we'll start to have a lot of resistance to local governments, and we'll see a lot of backcountry movements popping up. The indentured servants, just like social mobility in the colonies, you will have a decent amount of social mobility in certain areas. I would say probably not so much in the South. Most indentured servants coming over here as indentured servants will remain on the lower aspect of the food chain in terms of the social structure for their entire lives. And and I think that's something that they're pretty resentful of. And again, leading to a lot of these backcountry rebellions that we'll look at. Oh, William Berkeley. Doesn't he have beautiful hair? Girls, you have to admit, he probably has hair better than many of your girlfriends out there. Oh, you just want to run your fingers through it. Oh, William Berkeley. Anyways, William Berkeley was the governor of Jamestown, and what's important about him that you guys know is that he basically had a lot of deals with Native American Indians in the area. He traded various things for furs, and the Native American Indians would provide those furs, and he would get pretty wealthy off of it. He would buy off legislators, because a lot of legislators are like, what the heck are you doing? You're giving money to these Native American Indians, you're giving goods to these Native American Indians, you are getting furs in return. You are basically getting wealthy off of this situation. So, he bought off legislators. They like, leave me alone. I'll give you a new job. I'll give you a little bit of money. Basically blackmailing for the most part. He gave land grants to friends. Hopefully you can see, he's not the most popular guy in the world, for sure. Now, one of the things that's going on, and this is in Jamestown, he's the governor of Jamestown. One of the things going on in Jamestown is that a lot of your former indentured servants, again, didn't get their land that they were promised, and so now they're off in the backcountry area, and they're looking at what Berkeley's doing and how he's kind of like favoring Native American Indians, and these backcountry guys who are creating their own homesteads, trying to protect themselves and stuff like that. They want Berkeley's government to help them out. And it kind of appears that Berkeley is actually favoring the Indians over the white backcountry settlers. And that's something that the backcountry settlers, these former indentured servants are just going to be like, this guy's not cool. You look at some of the other things on here, that he refused elections to the assembly, and the assembly was basically the backcountry guys' representation. Landless freemen had no vote, inequality in taxation. It was really, really bad in Jamestown, in other areas as well in the South, where you would have the poorer groups of people actually paying more money in taxes than the wealthy did. You look at who's creating the laws, who's creating taxation. Generally, it's going to be the upper houses of the legislature that's going to be putting these laws and stuff together, and basically they're benefiting themselves. And as a result, the lower classes are ending up having to pay more taxes. And of course, these poor people aren't going to like that, especially these former indentured servants who are now trying to, get by on their own. So looking at the indentured servants, these newly freed indentured servants, again, they didn't get the land that they were promised. They were not allowed to vote. They had to pay rent if they If they got land, a lot of times it was land that somebody already owned, so they had to pay rent to a landowner, something like that. And so a lot of them basically just said, well, the heck with all of this. I'm going to go out on my own. I'm going to do my own thing. And of course, they get involved with Indians. And the backcountry people are like, to Berkeley and to the Jamestown government, their expectation was that the government was going to back them. The government was going to send the local militias out to deal with the Native American Indians and to make it easier for the white backcountry guys to actually put their settlements together. So they asked for permission to, yes, I'm not using this term lightly, but to exterminate the Indians. That's exactly what they wanted to do. Now, initially, Berkeley is going to be like, all right, go ahead and do this, but he's going to see that things kind of go astray. These guys are going out there and scalping and just murdering these people left and right. And remember, Berkeley has a relationship with the Indians. So he's kind of like, maybe I made the wrong decision. So then he's going to reverse his position. And then the former indentured servants are like, what? And as a result, the former indentured servants come back into Jamestown with their guns pointed at, boom, went Berkeley and the local government that's in power. Now, these former indentured servants are going to find a friend actually in someone who was part of the aristocracy, a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. And he was on the side of the indentured servants. He believed that these white indentured servants should have every bit of help they could from Berkeley and the government. He put together a little manifesto that basically is going to state his perceived rights of the indentured servants. And he's the one who's going to really be pushing for that permission to exterminate the Indians. Again, which Berkeley initially is going to sign on to. But there's some other things that Bacon is going to be pushing for. Things like freedom to the servants, land, lower taxes. The upper classes were just like, dude, you're crazy. And so he was expelled because the upper classes did not want to give more power and more authority to the lower class people. So he was expelled from the council. He was arrested, and eventually, of course, he's going to be released. And some of the things that the backcountry men wanted eventually will happen, like curbing the power of the governor and restoring voting rights to landless, or I shouldn't say landless necessarily, but to the lower class people. But the problem is that these reforms are going to be too little too late. The backcountry men were so resentful of all of the years that they felt that they were being exploited as indentured servants and as former indentured servants. So, it's all going to culminate into what was known as Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. And this is one of those things that you really have to know. It's very significant. It changes something socially and economically big time in the colonies. So again, I'm seeing here you have this unhappiness with the former indentured servants. They're not satisfied. They don't feel that their government is adequately representing them. And so they're going to rise up and they're going to rebel with Nathaniel Bacon as their leader of the movement. So you have a big old rebellion, like I mentioned. They initially go out, they try to exterminate the Indians. When Berkeley says, oh, no, you can't do that. And I said you could, but now you can't. They're going to be like, And so they come into Jamestown with their guns. They actually burned down Jamestown. I mean, that's how angry they were at the situation. There's a couple of things, going on with this that are quite important. And by the way, Bacon ends up dying. He has like dysentery or something. And once he dies, he was kind of like that focal point, the ringleader. He was the guy keeping everything together. So once he dies, it's kind of like, well, there's no one to follow anymore. So the movement as a whole is going to eventually die out. But there's some really important things about this particular backcountry rebellion. A couple things. First, the backcountry against the gentry. So it's a class issue where you have the lower class against the upper class. I mean, that's something that we're going to see. We even see that today. right? If you guys remember, the whole the wealthiest 1%, and a few years ago, and a lot of people were protesting against businesses and whatnot. We still see that. East versus West. We'll see this a lot in U.S. history. This idea of the East being that of the upper class, wealthy, merchants, industry, and the West being farmers for the most part. And we'll see in our history that several times you'll have, sorry, I just messed with the microphone there. Hopefully that didn't sound bizarre. Anyways, what was I talking about? Oh, yes. So this East versus West thing. So we see this a lot where you're going to have the what is perceived as the wealthy East and what is perceived as the lower class West. So again, a class issue, I guess, as well. And the West will rise up several times against what they perceive as being the immoral aspects of the East. What else is important on here? One of the biggest things that's going to come out of Bacon's Rebellion that you want to remember. Now, indentured servitude is still going on during this time. There are definitely more and more African slaves being used around 1676 or so, but you still have a lot of indentured servants being used. What's going to happen with those indentured servants when they get their freedom? We all know that the vast majority of them aren't going to get the land that they promised. All right, and so these indentured servants who are currently working now, they're seeing what's going on, and they're like, wait a minute, this could be my future as well, where I think that I am not represented equally, that they're not going to protect me against Native American Indians. So a lot of the planters who were using indentured servants at this time were kind of like, well, I don't know if they're the best source of labor to use. They might be very unstable. And if they're an unstable source of labor, then what does that mean for my plantation? What does that mean for my livelihood? The fear of these planters was that the indentured servants would begin to rise up as indentured servants, not waiting until they get their servitude. These indentured servants, again, are seeing what's going on, what their path of life might actually be, and the planters they're kind of scared about that. So what we begin to see then is a greater usage of African slaves as a result of Bacon's Rebellion. It's not like all of a sudden you have Bacon's Rebellion and boom, you've got African slavery and that's it. No, not quite like that. It takes many years for that process to happen. However, this is kind of one of those turning point things. It's a game changer. Where we begin to see this shift from using primarily indentured servants to moving more towards using African chattel slavery. Okay, so that's important. So we're looking at these two things right here, the backcountry against the gentry, East versus West. So it's a geographical thing, it's a class thing, and then also of significance is the fact that more African American slaves are now going to be used because they're seen as more a controllable labor source. Because again, they're going to have some pretty serious codes they're going to be imposed on African Americans. So reviewing colonial slavery a little bit, we saw slaves coming in from Dutch ships in 1619, and we begin to see a steady, slow but steady growth of the use of African slaves. With Bacon's Rebellion, as we just mentioned, you begin to see that shift away from using indentured servants, more towards using African slaves. And then when that happens, when there's more and more slaves coming into the colonies, and several colonies are going to have more slaves than they do white people, especially in the South. Like South Carolina is a really good example of that. We're going to start to see more codes, more laws that are going to be imposed upon African slaves. And this all culminates in the last point that I have here about Virginia legalizing chattel slavery, which is basically slavery based upon laws that these people do not have political civil rights whatsoever. So once we see more slaves coming in, you begin to see more stricter rules and regulations on them. And also, starting in the late 1600s, 1671, 1698, right around there, you're starting to see, again, more slaves coming in. One big thing is that the Royal African Company, which had a monopoly on the slave trade, supposedly, within the colonies, that they lose their monopoly on the slave trade. So when they lose that, you have more and more slaves coming in because you'll have other ships coming in from different countries that are going to have slaves. And when you increase the amount of slaves that are available, it also is going to decrease the cost of the slaves. So it will become a little bit cheaper. In fact, they'll become a lot bit cheaper, actually. And with indentured servants, because they were seen as white and they were servants eventually going to get their freedom, that the masters of the indentured servants, they tended to treat them a little bit better. They fed them better, gave them better clothing and provisions and housing and things like that. But with legalized chattel slavery, with African slaves, they're not going to provide all that stuff. I mean, they'll provide basic necessities, but the basic necessities are definitely cheaper than actually having the indentured servants and providing more decent stuff for them. So slavery will at one point in time become somewhat cheaper than having indentured servants. Okay, so economic. Looking at Africans in America, I mean, you guys know about slavery and the conditions and what it was like for these people. It did kind of depend upon where you were in terms of how harsh it was. Of course, it's going to be the worst in the South. The deeper south you go, the worse it is. Chesapeake was probably one of the better places. I mean, they did have game systems and things like that in the Chesapeake, but the more you go south, where you have this more developed system of racism going on, and you'll have racism everywhere in the colonies, don't get me wrong, but I mean, it really develops in the South, especially in these areas where you have a majority of slaves over white people. So you have all these slaves coming into the colonies. Most conditions for the slaves are pretty bad. Again, it's probably a little bit better in the northern part of the South. And if there were any slaves in the New England area, they're probably treated better than those in the Chesapeake. Those in the South are probably treated worse than in the Chesapeake. So again, it kind of depends upon where you were as a slave in terms of how well your conditions were. One of the things that Africans will end up doing eventually is creating what eventually will become the African American. You have so many Africans coming from different areas in Africa. They speak different languages, they have different cultures. So when these slaves come to America, it's not like they all get together and they're like, yay, let's have a party, we all know each other, yay. A lot of the slave traders deliberately tried to mix these cultures all up. So they didn't know each other, so they didn't speak the same languages, they didn't have the same culture. But eventually what will happen, and this may take a generation or two, is that they'll learn a common language, they will have a common culture on the farm, the plantation. And when you begin to have that common culture, it's going to be a mix of both African cultures and American cultures. And when you have that blending of the two, that's what gives us the African American. Okay. Now, definitely one of the things that the slave owners are going to be very concerned about would be uncontrolled gatherings of slaves. Again, we don't have 100% controlled chattel slavery going on from the minute slaves got here. There were free slaves, or I should say free slaves, there were free black people that were here. There were black slaves who were able to purchase their freedom. In some areas, you had slaves kind of living outside of the direct contact of their owners. So you had situations where in some areas blacks were coming together, talking about life, and just whenever people get together, whatever they talk about. So of course the white slave owners, and especially as slavery is becoming more and more and more of a controlled thing, and there's more and more and more slaves that are here, there is a growing concern among white plantation owners that if you start to have these large uncontrolled gatherings of slaves, are going to rise up. So of course you know, they're going to want to do something about it. You know, and let's be honest with ourselves. I mean, seriously, what begins to happen is you begin to have a clampdown on slaves within the colonies. And again, especially we're talking about in the South. You had slave patrols under colonial militia. They became very harsh towards the slaves. You know, and the slaves didn't like whatever aspect of freedom they were able to hold on to. They didn't like the fact that it was being taken away from them. So of course they're going to respond with arson, theft, and violence. There were several early slave revolts. The most significant one that you probably should know is the Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739, where you have a bunch of slaves that are going to rise up. They're going to kill many white plantation owners. The rebellion eventually will be put down by the local militia. Many of them will be hanged, you know, and they'll serve as an example to other slaves that, you know, don't do this, or this is what's going to happen to you. But what's important about the Stoner Rebellion is, well, I think two things. One, the fact that slaves valued the idea of freedom and that they would try to rebel if they could. And then secondly, what white people are going to do in the South. Harsher codes, tighter regulations, fines, should say, for not disciplining slaves. So you may have had some plantations, some slave owners who treat their slaves, you know, fairly well. Maybe they went out somewhere where they were out like past their curfew, for instance, and maybe the slave owner didn't really do anything about it. Well, now you have stricter rules in South Carolina, and you'll have this in our places as well, but where the government, local governments will fine the plantation owners for not disciplining their slaves if they did something they weren't supposed to do. You know, we're really looking at tightening the grip on slavery as a result of these early rebellions. The Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina, the one in New York City in 1712. And then also the issue of freedom. Remember, I told you guys that there were blacks that were free in the colonies, and in one way some slaves could do it is they could buy their freedom, they could work for their freedom. So manumission is just a fancy schmancy word for, you know, getting your freedom. So let's say you had a slave that you thought was awesome, like, oh man, this guy would be a great participant in society, you know, he worked for me really hard, he's a great guy. Yeah, you know, he's worked hard, he's paid off his debts to me, and I'm going to give him his freedom. I can't do that anymore as a slave owner. I have to actually go to the local government and request for manumission or for the freedom of my slave, which, as you guys can guess, 99% of the time, not going to happen. Looking at Southern society, very hierarchical, stratified, and what I have is like kind of a list of the who's on top and who's on the bottom. So of course on top of society would be your wealthy planters, landowners, your gentry class. Right below them would be your small farmers, that's the largest social group in the South. And this is actually an important point that I want to make now, and I'll say this several times as we go through this all the way through the Civil War. The vast majority of people in the South did not own slaves. So it's a small percentage. About 25% or so own slaves. It's a big myth about the South that everyone owned slaves. Okay, it was relatively expensive for most people. Okay, so most of the people who own slaves are going to be in that top, that wealthy planters, the gentry class. A lot of small farmers, they may have had one slave, two slaves, maybe, but again, most people did not own slaves in the South. Below the small farmers, you have landless whites. Below them, the indentured servants, and of course, slaves are going to be at the very, very bottom. We've already talked about how because of environmental, geographical conditions in the South, that there's a very high mortality rate. Women all across the colonies this time, regardless of what region, aren't going to have a whole lot of rights, but there are some things that are kind of significant to talk about. Because you had a high mortality rate in the South, a lot of times when men died, a lot of times women in the South were able to actually inherit that property and actually work the land and kind of be the business owner of that plantation or that farm. So, you know, that's a little bit of economic freedom that some women had, but again, they'd have to wait till their husband dies for that to happen. They couldn't vote. Women aren't going to be able to vote anywhere for a very long time. 1920, actually, the 19th Amendment was ratified, so we'll be talking about women's quest to vote for a long, long time. And because you had more men coming into the South than you had women, they didn't migrate largely as family units, you have that skewed sexual ratio. So you've got more men than women. Like I said, that does give women some semblance of empowerment because they do have the ability to choose who their husbands are going to be. And then remember too, we talked about how in the South you don't really have the development of major cities. Charlestown or Charleston will be the biggest of the cities in the South, major port city, lots of trade going on. I think it was like the third or fourth largest city in the Americas during the colonial period. So it was, you know, for the colonies as a whole, not just for its region, it was a major, major city. But again, you don't really see a lot of cities in the South, largely because you have all these plantations that are all over the place, and county governments tend to be what kind of governed over these plantations. And a lot of plantations were kind of like, they're so big that they were kind of like a city unto itself. So they just didn't develop. It wasn't a priority of the South. So that's a little bit about the South. So let's go ahead and focus on New England society and kind of compare and contrast that to the Chesapeake in the South. So definitely New England, definitely more hospitable than the South. Huge difference you're going to see is a type of agriculture that is practiced in New England. Now remember, agriculture was the main economic activity of all the colonies, regardless of what region. However, in the New England colonies, it's more small-scale agriculture. And the reason why you don't really see the development of large-scale plantation agriculture in New England is because of the soils, which we've already looked at. You know, rocky soils, it was hard. They'd have to move all this rock out and stuff. And so they kind of focus on small farms producing food and cash crops, small cash crops. There's a big merchant group in New England, Boston, Philadelphia in particular. In these regions along the coast, you know, fishing is going to be huge. Shipbuilding is going to be massive. One of the biggest industries in New England, especially again along the coastal area. The more inland you get, it's more about agriculture. Their economy is much more diverse, you know, as compared to the South. The South, we're looking largely at large-scale plantation agriculture based upon slave labor, whereas in New England, we're largely looking at several things. So small farms, you're going to have peddlers, you're going to have merchants, artisans, you know, all kinds of different types of people are going to be making a living in the New England area. Also very important, how you had a lot of people migrating as family units into New England as opposed to the South, where it's mostly single men. You know, that is significant because we're looking at, as these families come in, you have a stake in the success of the colony. You want to make sure that your family thrives, that they don't die, and that you build cities and institutions and things that are going to benefit and enhance the family experience. So that's why we're going to have development of a lot of little towns in the area. Education, again, is going to be huge as a result of migration of family units. One of the things also about New England, and you know, the South is relatively homogenous as well, because you don't have a lot of people coming in from, you know, different areas in the world, like we'll see in the Middle Colonies, for instance. We're looking at homogenous, mostly white English people. Again, lots of Puritans coming into the area. So relatively homogenous in terms of who they are, racial background. A lot of them are going to be middle class in New England. So again, a lot of similarities between the people that are going there. So relatively homogeneous society. Lots of families in New England, and you know, that was something that was really encouraged. It was something that was expected, and people got married pretty young, actually. A lot of them in their teens, and I think I mentioned this before. You know, women really could expect being pregnant a majority of their life. So on average, we're looking at pregnancy every 2 years or so. And we're looking at maybe 8 to 10 children that survived per family, which is a lot of people. So one of the things about this point is that um, we'll have population increasing by natural reproduction, as opposed to the South, where it was because of indentured servants and slaves, not necessarily natural reproduction. Um, so that was by the 1650s or so, you'd see that. Um, One of the things that was expected of women during this time was to nurture their children and to give them religious education, reading education. This is how you read, and a lot of it was for the education aspect was for you to be able to read the Bible. And again, that was one of the things that women were supposed to do. Women were seen as being more moral and pure and all of that. So that duty was kind of reserved for the women, childcare in particular, house cleaning, that type of thing, just maintaining the house. Didn't see a whole lot of divorce in um, the New England area, or really in anywhere in the colonies for that matter. Did happen. It was permitted, but a lot of times it wasn't allowed, if that makes any sense. So you might have someone requesting a divorce, but the local magistrates would not allow for it. Hmm. Women, a little bit more about what, yes, that is a woman, actually, I think. I'm not sure. Mm, very attractive. Anyways, women. These are the types of things that women were expected to do living in the New England area. And a lot of this is going to apply to the middle colonies and to the South as well. Homemakers, again, the idea of nurturing, caring for children, they were very important economically to the household because a lot of the things they did, like making clothing and making and preparing food, a lot of women were able to take some of the things that they made, be it clothing, it could be that they churned butter or whatever it happened to be, that they would go out and sell these things. So that would help with the economy of the household as well. Of course, some of the more negative things, no property rights. You didn't really see that a whole lot in New England. Again, we did talk about in the South how women could potentially get some land if their husband died or whatnot. You didn't see that a whole lot in New England. Um, they did have some protections against abuse, but it happened, where you're going to have spousal abuse against their wives. They couldn't vote. Probably the one that catches, I think, a lot of girls today the most is that women didn't have their own legal identity. That basically their legal identity was that of their husband. They had no say-so in anything whatsoever when it came to political things. Everything had to be cleared through the husband. It was almost like, kind of in a weird, twisted way, almost like the woman was the child of the husband. In many, I know I have protection against abuse, but like I said, there are many places where it was perfectly legal for men to beat their wives. And really, she didn't have much say-so to that. Again, she could request divorce. Sometimes it might be granted, other times it may not. Now, one of the things where I think that women are going to have it pretty good is when it comes to religion and spirituality. That women played a big role, especially in Puritan society. Like I said, I mean, it was really kind of their job to make sure that the kids were getting a religious education, things like that. We'll see through what's called the Great Awakening that women are going to play a big role in promoting religion within the colony. So, that I think is pretty significant. It's empowering for women. Now, if the husband did go away, and that happened a lot where men would have to take on a second job, whatever, so they would leave their town, their city, and go somewhere else for a week or so. Now, while the husband was away, the woman could become what they call a deputy husband, so kind of like in the place of the husband, and she could then make decisions while he was gone. Okay. One of the things also that women do, and I think girls still do this quite a bit today, is gossiping. And this was one way that women could gain some social power. And we'll see this with the Salem witch trials, actually. We talked about how New England developed many small towns. Each of the towns had a town hall where they did a lot of their government type stuff. It was a form of a direct democracy. All the citizens would go to the town hall and they would vote on things that would affect how their colony was being governed. But again, remember, it wasn't a majority of people that were allowed to do that. Again, very important is this point right here that towns of 50 plus had to provide an elementary education. So again, when you're comparing the New England colonies to the South, definitely New England is going to be much more well learned than the South, highly educated. And we'll see a lot of the colleges that some of you guys are familiar with, which I'll go over on our slide, actually come about during this time period. Harvard is one of them. This is the first major college of the New England area. Now, one thing to remember about colleges during this time, it wasn't like you go to college and get a liberal education. It wasn't like you were taking math and science and literature and history and all of that. Basically, the main purpose of college during this time was to train men, young men, to be ministers. So there was a religious purpose to that. And because, again, education was such a focus of New England, very high literacy rate as compared to, say, the South. Middle colonies are going to be pretty comparable with New England when it comes to that aspect as well. Now, religion, as you guys know, was a big part of the development of New England, with the Puritans coming into Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay Colony. But you got to understand that it's not going to last. That religious zeal, that almost city upon a hill and all of that, that's just not going to last. It's like you guys. You start school, you're like, yeah, I'm going to do awesome this year. I'm going to do all my homework assignments. You do that for like a week or two. And then you're like, meh, this is just like it always has been. It sucks. And then you stop doing it. Well, kind of the same thing we see going on in New England. That religion is gonna lessen significantly. And of course, the church, who wields a lot of control over society, is really concerned about the fact that you have a lot of people who are not going to church anymore, for instance. So they issued this thing called the Jeremiad. And essentially, this was kind of like a slap on the wrist thing. You better go back to church or else. So it's kind of like scolding the colonists. So, to the church, who again had a lot of authority and control over society in New England, they needed to get people back into the church so they could continue to have that power and control over them. They need to keep that membership in the church alive. But like I said, things just changed. And not everyone wanted necessarily to go back to church. And it was hard to become a viable, real member of the church. Only visible saints received membership. These people who it was apparent through, the good works. And remember, talking about Puritan work ethic and all of that. They had a conversion experience in front of everyone. They were like, "Wow, I'm converted. I'm saved." They are the ones that get membership in the church. They get to vote and all that. No one else could. And I think it's one of the reasons why you had people stop going to church during the time. So again, the church wants to increase the membership because they want to maintain that authority over the people in the colony. So they kind of had a compromise, which they were called the halfway covenant. And you should remember the halfway covenant, where you had children of partial members that could receive baptism. So we're looking at a partial member is not a visible saint. They're not a full member of the church, but their children could receive baptism. And then when they got older, they could have their little conversion experience and all of that, and they could become full members or whatever. And a lot of like hardcore people that were in the church at this time, a lot of your visible saints, they thought this was like blasphemy. This was terrible. This was horrible. You couldn't do this. So some of the people who protested this idea of the halfway covenant broke off, formed their own church, which is the Baptist church, a little bit more strict and regulated. Eventually, it came to the point where the church had to let everyone join because they had that dwindling members. And of significance is women becoming a majority within this is the Congregational church I'm talking about, by the way. So that would be opposed to the Anglican church, which you see in the South, which was the same church that came from the Church of England. That was in the South. So in the New England colonies, the Congregational church, which came out of the Puritan faith. This was the church that was the official church of the region. So women become a majority in the congregational churches, and again, that is empowering for them to be a majority. And women as spiritual equals, they're going to be able to make decisions for the church, which again, very empowering. Now, also going on, even though you think that people becoming more educated and whatnot are more rational, the Enlightenment is starting to take hold, kind of, sort of, a little. You would think people would be thinking a little bit more rationally, but you still have people who are believers in the occult, in witchcraft, and they were all over the place. They thought that their society was inundated with witches and warlocks, which are or wizards, whatever, which are male witches. You began to have people accusing other people. And it was a lot of women, by the way. We talked about gossip earlier and how this could be a source of power. You have a lot of times lower class people that are going to be, through gossiping, you know how girls are, they're gossiping. And what's going to end up happening is that they're going to be gossiping about so-and-so is a witch. So-and-so is a witch. Did you hear that? Oh, they made something appear, they made a bird appear out of nothing, blah, blah, whatever, So you've got like all this gossip going on that certain people are witches or warlocks or wizards, whatever. And it's a class thing. Again, usually it was lower class accusing the upper class. And that's what's going to happen in Salem. Okay. Again, you're going to have 14 people hanged between 1647 and 62 in New England. It just became a complete mess. And I know you guys didn't read The Crucible. You guys read Scarlet Letter, but The Crucible, that book, is all about the Salem witch trials, okay? And the witch hunt that went on in Salem in the 1690s. That book is actually really about what happened in the 1950s when you had kind of the same thing going on where people were accusing other people of being communists. And so this is really good synthesis. Remember we talked about synthesis being able to tie certain things to different time periods. So the book, The Crucible, was actually written in the 1950s when you had this communist witch hunt going on during the time. So it's a really good comparison that you can make if you get a question of some sort, DBQ question on either this time period or the 1950s and the Red Scare that happened during that time. Anyways, going back to Salem here, essentially, like I said, what you have is a bunch of younger girls that are gossiping, and they're claiming that certain people are witches. And again, trying to make this long story short here, is that you had all of these trials that were going on, and people were being accused. They were put on trial. There were 18 women hanged. One person was crushed with rocks. They even killed a dog. Seriously? How can you kill a freaking dog? Who are these people? Anyways, it came to the point where the governor of Salem, his wife, was actually accused of being a witch, and then he was like, oh, no, wait, no, we can't do that. Excuse me. So once that happened, the governor said, no more. We're not going to do any more of these trials. So that was the end of the Salem witch trials, and also it marked the end of the Puritan era in New England. It's going to become a decent bit more secular. I think the Enlightenment also is going to play a role in that, the idea of rational thought. This stuff is just, it's kind of out there, and more people are thinking scientifically and logically about things, so they don't really believe in witches. And then also that more people are concerned about pursuing material wealth over religious wealth, if you want to look at it like that. So the motives of people, I think, are changing. It's more about material versus spiritual. All right. So that would be colonial society on the eve of revolution. I'm going to stop this right here, and this is going to be part one, the end of part one of this amazing lecture, playing catch up. All right, guys, signing off.